April 18th, 1906, a devastating earthquake hit the city of San Francisco, and in the next 3 days, virtually the entire city was destroyed in a fire that burned 512 city blocks and 28,000 buildings. How can a fire be so destructive? The answer to that: a firestorm. A firestorm is a kind of fire that's so vast it actually generates its own weather. And what it can do with that is truly devastating. A lot of people, especially here in California, remember the recent fire in the town of Paradise in Northern California, which obliterated the entire town in late 2018. 18,804 buildings destroyed and 86 fatalities. The fire burned through 70 miles in 1 hour, which was faster than 86 people could escape. What happened in San Francisco in 1906 was the same thing, a firestorm, except it was even bigger, and it ripped through the entire city. The death toll is unknown. The great novelist Jack London, the one who wrote The Call of the Wild, White Fang, and other classic stories, was there at the time. He was a journalist at that time, and he wrote his account of it, which begins, "Not in history has a modern imperial city been so completely destroyed. San Francisco is gone. Nothing remains of it but memories and a fringe of dwelling houses on its outskirts. Its industrial section is wiped out, its business section is wiped out, its social and residential section is wiped out. The factories and warehouses, the great stores and newspaper buildings, the hotels and the palaces of the nabobs are all gone. Remains only the fringe of dwelling houses on the outskirts of what was once San Francisco." Within an hour after the earthquake shook, the smoke of San Francisco's burning was a lurid tower visible 100 miles away, and for 3 days and nights the lurid tower swayed in the sky, reddening the sun, darkening the day, and filling the land with smoke. On Wednesday morning at 5:15 came the earthquake. A minute later the flames were leaping upward in a dozen different quarters south of Market Street. In the working-class ghetto and in the factories, fires started. There was no opposing the flames. There was no organization, no communication. All the cunning adjustments of a 20th century city had been smashed by the earthquake. The streets were humped into ridges and depressions and piled with the debris of fallen walls. The steel rails were twisted into perpendicular and horizontal angles. The telephone and telegraph systems were disrupted, and the great water mains had burst. All the shrewd contrivances and safeguards of man had been thrown out of gear by 30 seconds twitching of the Earth's crust. By Wednesday afternoon, inside of 12 hours, half the heart of the city was gone. At that time I watched the vast conflagration from out on the bay. It was dead calm. Not a flicker of wind stirred. Yet from every side wind was pouring in upon the city. East, west, north, south, strong winds were blowing upon the doomed city. The heated air rising made an enormous suck. Thus did the fire of itself build its own colossal chimney through the atmosphere. Day and night this dead calm continued, and yet near to the flames, the wind was often half a gale, so mighty was the force. Wednesday night saw the destruction of the very heart of the city. Dynamite was lavishly used, and many of San Francisco's proudest structures were crumbled by man and by man himself into ruins. But there was no withstanding the onrush of the flames. Time and again, successful stands were made by the firefighters, and every time the flames flanked around on either side or came up from the rear and turned to defeat the hard-won victory. A few years earlier, there was the city fire chief by the name of Dennis Sullivan, and he was pretty incredible. He was just amazing at his job, and the city by this time was basically a giant tinderbox. Almost all the buildings were made of wood, except for the really large ones, and as a result, the fire department under his management had become exquisitely efficient and effective. A visitor from Chicago itself, having had the Great Fire of Chicago only a couple of decades earlier, did remark upon how it was amazing that San Francisco had not yet burned. And that was due to Dennis Sullivan. A few years before this happened, there was a terrible fire in this marvelous new thing called the High Rise, a place called the Baldwin Hotel. And when Sullivan and his remarkable crews arrived on scene, he found to his absolute horror there was nothing he could do. There were hundreds of people trapped in the upper floors, and there was nothing he could do because the pressure from the water hoses was not enough to reach the heights of these new high-rises. He asked the city to build massive tanks on top of Twin Peaks and let the gravity provide the water pressure needed to fight fires in high-rises. They told him that there was no need for this because the city had the best fire department in the world, which is ironically true, thanks to the person who was asking for this change. So they really, really should have listened. I have heard it speculated that Dennis Sullivan may have been the only person around who would have known what to do with the water mains broken, except the morning of the earthquake, part of the California hotel next to the firehouse where he was living collapsed down through the firehouse and ripped through it. It was significantly lower. And when it did so, it took Dennis Sullivan with it. He got pinned to a steam register, and it took him 3 days to die, which is horrifying. But perhaps even worse was the fact that he wasn't there to be able to advise the crews. And not knowing what to do, they ran out of ideas very fast and decided to try to make fire breaks however they possibly could. The answer to that was dynamite. And so they would try to blow fire breaks through the city, and many of them caused many fires themselves. But it was literally the only thing they could do at that point. One really convenient thing for history buffs like myself is that only within a couple of years before the earthquake was the first really commercially viable mass market camera. So while they weren't cheap, an ordinary family could afford a camera. As a result, you get lots of people able to take photos of everything as it happens, which is pretty new at that time. Prior to then, you'd have a few serious photographers like Arnold Gente, and they would provide pictures, which is good, but you get a much greater breadth of information when there are thousands of different people doing that across the city. However, Arnold Gente was in fact in San Francisco at the time, and he also has a first-hand account. It seems as if I had scarcely been asleep when I was awakened by a terrifying sound. The Chinese porcelains that I've been collecting in the last years had crashed to the floor. My interest in Chinese porcelains ever since then has been purely platonic. The whole house was creaking and shaking, and the chandelier was swinging like a pendulum, and I felt as if I were on a ship tossed about by a rough sea. This can't go on much longer, I said to myself. When a house shakes like this, the ceiling is bound to collapse. As soon as the plaster begins to fall, I'll cover my head and accept what comes. An ominous quiet followed. I'll have the rest of his witness account, along with the witness accounts of Jack London and Enrico Caruso and General Funston as well. I'll have all those in separate videos, so if you're really interested, you can go and watch all of them, which I highly recommend. Hi there. Be sure to like and subscribe for more of the fantastical stories that history is full of. There are going to be more, and they're all, every one of them, going to be completely awesome. See you then.